Now, Jagtar Singh Johal from Dumbarton has been in an Indian jail for almost 6 years, facing the death penalty for alleged terror offences.
A cross-party group of MPs are now calling on Rishi Sunak to raise the issue with the Indian Prime Minister when he visits the country this week. In a moment, we'll hear from one of those MPs, the former Brexit Secretary David Davis. But first, the Nine's Hazel Martin takes a look back at the case.
Jagtar Singh Johal hasn't been home in almost 6 years. He faces the death penalty in India, where he's been imprisoned since November 2017. He's accused of involvement in a terror plot against right-wing Hindu leaders. His family say he was abducted, beaten and tortured in the weeks after his wedding in India in 2017. The Indian authorities deny this. His supporters say his work highlighting the rights of the minority Sikh population brought him to the attention of Indian authorities. Jagtar has been before the Indian courts hundreds of times, but proceedings are often pushed back. A UN working group has found his detention lacks legal basis. His family say both Theresa May and Boris Johnson had discussed the case with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The UK government claims they've raised it many times with the country's government. Now, more than 70 MPs have signed a letter urging Rishi Sunak to bring up the 36-year-old's case when he visits Delhi for the G20 summit. Hazel Martin, BBC News.
Well, as Hazel said, more than 70 MPs have signed a letter urging the British Prime Minister to push Indian PM Narendra Modi to release Mr Johal. Earlier, I spoke to one of those MPs, David Davis, and also Dan Dolan from the human rights group Reprieve.
It's a plain case of injustice. I mean, Mr Johal was arrested on his honeymoon, well, actually bundled into the back of a van, more accurately. He was tortured by electrocution and other physical methods. He was, through that torture, forced to sign a blank sheet of paper and make confessions on video to hanging offences. Who would do that unless they were under duress? And since then, he has been in prison for 5 years without trial. And the UN has determined it's an arbitrary arrest, an arbitrary imprisonment, and we should be calling for him to be released. I mean, it is really as simple as that, and that's why you've got so many MPs from so many parts of the House of Commons, so many different parties in the House of Commons pursuing this.
And Dan Dolan of Reprieve, why do you think it is that the efforts so far have failed to come up with any solution to this case, that he is still in prison after almost 6 years?
Well, unfortunately, the efforts on behalf of the UK Foreign Office and the UK government have been far short of what a British national should expect when they're brutally tortured into confessing to charges which are totally trumped up and carry the death penalty. I mean, if this was, you know, one of your sons or your brother or your best friend, would you expect this treatment from the British government? And I think, you know, it's really worrying that there hasn't been a stronger stance on Jagtar's behalf. The solution in this case is actually political rather than legal. The legal case in India, if it continued at the pace it's running, it's been calculated it would take 40 years before there was even a judgment. The answer here is for the Prime Minister to do what is right and what many Prime Ministers before him have not done, sadly, over the last few years, and seek a deal with India that can see Jagtar return to his family in the UK, which, as David says, is what the UN has called for to happen.
David Davis, what do you say to that? Because Jagtar's family have told us that former Prime Ministers Boris Johnson and Theresa May both discussed the case with the Indian Prime Minister, but then the family also received a letter in the summer from Foreign Secretary James Cleverly, who said it was decided best not to press India over the issue.
Yes, and the argument put by Mr Cleverly in that letter was, well, if we push, they'll be difficult with us and they'll deny us consular visits and that sort of thing. Well, I'm sorry, but a sovereign nation shouldn't give in to that sort of behaviour. If we give in to that sort of behaviour with India, then the next time it comes along, it'll be Iran trying it on, or China, or whatever. We have to represent the case firmly and strongly with them. Now, there have been arguments come back to me from the Foreign Office saying, oh, well, you know, we've got to press for a trial, we can't press for release. I'm sorry, I don't agree. You know, this is an arbitrary arrest. The UN has found that. It involves torture. The UN has found that. That is a completely improper treatment of a British citizen, let alone by an ally. We'll get angry if Russia did it. But if an ally does it, an ally with whom we're having negotiations over, let's say, migration numbers, then we should make it a part of the discussion. Indeed, it should be the beginning of the discussion. Now, to be fair to Mr. Sunak, it's a G20 meeting, so he'll only have a very brief time with Mr. Modi, but he should nevertheless mention it, in my view.
And David Davis, would you expect there to be some form of perhaps softer diplomacy, let's say, soft, quieter diplomacy? Because the Prime Minister's spokesperson has talked about this today and said that the government had raised concerns relating to Jagtar with the Indian government on more than 100 occasions. But do you suspect that there might be more going on perhaps in talks than we know about or they're willing to talk about?
There's no doubt about it. But the simple truth is that countries like India draw a conclusion from how high a level we raise these things at. If you are just talked to by the ambassador nicely, or sorry, the High Commissioner in India, it's a Commonwealth country, if you're just talked to by the High Commissioner and it's not brought up in a conversation with the Foreign Secretary, it's not brought up in a conversation with the Prime Minister, they may draw the conclusion that we don't care that much about it, and we mustn't let that happen. It must be made very plain that this is a very high priority. Soft diplomacy is all very well. I used to be a Foreign Office Minister, and we use soft diplomacy a lot, but when soft diplomacy doesn't work, then we have to be firmer, and that's what we're asking for.
And Dan Dolan, what more can you tell us about the relationship between the UK and India and how difficult it might be to get a British citizen out at this stage?
Well, just to come back to the point you made about what the Prime Minister said, I mean, the government is saying how many times it's raised Jagtar's case. Oh, we've raised it more than 100 times. But that disguises the fact the important thing isn't how many times you raise it, it's what you say, and as David Davis says, what level you raise it at. And the UK has been asking for things like, oh, can we get access to Jagtar in jail? Of course, that's the very least of what Jagtar should be expecting. What he could reasonably expect as a British citizen is that his government would say, okay, the UN has found you to be arbitrarily detained, you've been brutally tortured, you're facing a death sentence on trumped-up charges, we will advocate for you to come home in line with the UN's recommendation. And that, as David Davis says, is what the Prime Minister should be doing, and frankly has what the British government has done in the past on behalf of other British nationals. But there is a tendency from the Foreign Office to do these things too slowly and wait years while people languish in prison until finally getting to the point where the courage is taken to do the right thing. And we really need to be at that point right now. Jagtar shouldn't see a 6th year in nearly total solitary confinement. He needs to be back with his family in Dumbarton.
That was Dan Dolan of Reprieve and the MP David Davis speaking to me there. Well, Rishi Sunak's spokesman said that Mr Johal's family are receiving consular assistance and that Foreign Office Minister Lord Ahmed had met them recently.